Plymouth was the world's most prosperous city in 1957. In addition to releasing some of the most stunning and daring vehicles of the decade, they accomplished something that few people believed was possible. They overtook Buick to become the third best-selling automaker in the United States. That year was the apex of Plymouth's achievements, a win in a market that was extremely competitive. However, all fell apart in 1961, just 4 years later. A once untouchable brand started its long, methodical decline into obscurity as sales fell and customers drifted away. What then took place? In fewer than 5 years, how did Plymouth go from controlling the market to fighting for its life? This is the tale of how a single vehicle, the 1961 Plymouth, became the symbol of an automotive catastrophe due to its excessive attempts to stand out in a world that had already changed, rather of any mechanical issues. The golden year was 1957. Plymouth launched the forward-look era, a design movement that featured futuristic lines, sweeping tailfins, and forceful attitudes that stopped people cold. Under the creative leadership of designer Virgil Exner, the marketing phrase, "Suddenly, it's 1960, summed everything up. America adored the futuristic appearance of Plymouth automobiles. With more than 762,000 sold that year, Plymouth jumped ahead of Buick and cemented its place among the big three Ford, Chevrolet, and Plymouth, with an outstanding 19.3% of the market. The brand had a distinct identity, confidence, and momentum. However, the seeds of disaster had already started to germinate. The numbers began to fall about a year after they peaked. The auto industry was severely impacted by the national recession in 1958. But Plymouth fared worse than others. Sales declined. The 1957 versions were criticized for their shoddy construction, quick rusting, and inadequate maintenance. Consumers, who had previously been enthralled with the brand, started to reconsider. Beyond the quality problems and economic downturn, however, a more subtle and serious issue was developing. Plymouth had lost its design orientation. They doubled down on a recipe that was no longer effective, rather than adjusting to changing consumer preferences. Plymouth's yearly sales dropped to barely 350,000 vehicles by 1961, which was less than half of what they had sold in 1957. In a remarkably short period of time, their market share fell to 11.6%, and the 1961 Plymouth, the vehicle that would become notorious, brought everything to a head. Still euphoric from 1957's success, Plymouth's designers made the fatal mistake of assuming that if something worked in the past, it should be repeated. That philosophy was already beginning to show flaws in the 1960 model. The automobile, which was based on drawings made in 1957, had its 118-inch wheelbase, but it also got longer, had a wider grille, and bigger tailfins, giving the impression that Plymouth was still living in the good old days. The public, however, had moved on. Customers desired elegance, simplicity, and sleekness by the early 1960s. Ford and Chevrolet were adopting more restrained shapes and streamlined lines. Plymouth, on the other hand, persisted in pursuing a past. A car that felt strangely out of rhythm, like an old postcard from a time no one wanted to go back to, was the end product. The 1961 Plymouth was a complete design disaster. If the 1960 model seemed outdated, it is still regarded as one of the most divisive front-end designs in American automobile history since World War II. Plymouth took a more minimalist approach than its rivals. Unusual curves, bulges above the wheel arches, and a character line that wound and curled down the fender before finishing in an ungainly rocker molding were all features of the front fascia. Rather than being a useful component of the vehicle, the bumper resembled a bizarre sculpture. It left viewers wondering, was it brave, was it hostile, or was it simply unattractive? Regretfully, this wasn't a concept car for a niche market. This was Plymouth's mainstream product, targeted at consumers on a tight budget who didn't want to make big statements, but instead wanted something modern, stylish, and dependable. Instead, they received an unfamiliar-looking vehicle. The lack of any true sense of balance in the design just made matters worse. The side profile gave the impression that someone had inflated various areas of the automobile at varying pressures. The upper body appeared bloated, and the rocker panels tapered inward. In actuality, this was the outcome of reusing components from the prior model. Budgetary restrictions forced the usage of doors and roof lines. Designers had to work around antiquated molds and were confined. The finished item resembled three separate cars that had been sewed together. The terrible aspect of this narrative is that the 1961 Plymouth was actually well developed behind the odd sheet metal. It signaled Plymouth's departure from the conventional body-on-frame design and its shift to complete unibody manufacturing. As a result, the car's handling, weight, and torsional rigidity all improved. Unibody vehicles were uncommon in the general market at the time. In a technical sense, Plymouth was in the lead. Unfortunately, however, not many customers were aware of it, and even fewer were concerned. They weren't admiring the car's engineering by getting underneath it. They were making snap judgments based on their initial observations. They didn't want to be seen driving the car, they observed. The facade wasn't the only surprise. It seemed increasingly stranger when you stepped inside. The steering wheel was a squared circle, or squircle. Although it was supposed to feel futuristic, it was actually difficult to handle, particularly when performing tight maneuvers. The dashboard didn't resemble a family vehicle at all, but rather the control panel of a spaceship. It was different, but not intuitive. A rolling drum speedometer, push-button transmissions on the left, and other dials arranged as if at random. In 1961, Plymouth subtly acknowledged that they had gone too far and switched back to a conventional, round steering wheel. There were still a lot of strange traits. Plymouth didn't know when to stop innovating, but they weren't scared to do it. Ironically, the design put off the majority of purchasers, but those who examined more closely saw significant performance potential. The V8 lineup of Plymouth's 1,960-61 vehicles was robust. There were two versions of the 318 V8, 230 and 260 horsepower. The 361 cubic inch engine that powered the Golden Commando 395 produced 305 horsepower. The Sonoramic Commando 383, a long-ram V8, with two 4-barrel carbs that produced 330 horsepower and had a 0 to 60 speed of less than 8 seconds, was the true star of the show. For its time, that is the domain of sports cars. In terms of economy, the Slant-Six 225 gained notoriety for its dependability, affordability, and simplicity of maintenance. Even the technology, which included a safety-matic system that automatically locked doors when the engine started, swivel chairs for ease access, and an available in-car record player for only $52, was ahead of its time. Plymouth didn't have the looks, but she had the goods. Plymouth had a roster that made sense on paper. Savoy's base model catered to consumers on a tight budget. Comfort and style were offered by the Belvedere. With its sportier appearance and availability to the most potent engines, the Fury was the top model. On the wagon side, the Suburban was priced between $2,600 and $3,000 and was available in 3 trim levels: Deluxe, Custom, and Sport. At almost every price point, there was performance, value, and variety. However, the design, the elephant in the room, overshadowed everything else. Buyers weren't even going that far, regardless of how useful the features were or how powerful the engine was. Long before a test drive, they were leaving. Motor Trend offered one of the harshest critiques, joking that the 1961 Plymouth resembled a vehicle that inspired a generation of Japanese sci-fi monsters. In addition to being humorous, the cruelly captured the sentiments of the customers. Neither performance nor price was Plymouth's issue. It was a picture. They created a car that didn't belong anywhere because they were so desperate to stand out. Experimental styling was not desired by mainstream consumers. They desired a vehicle that exuded poise, familiarity, and confidence. Rather, Plymouth produced what appeared to be a crude prototype that had inadvertently made it into production. If 1961 wasn't painful enough, Chrysler, Plymouth's parent corporation, made a huge mistake the next year. A rumor that General Motors was going to reduce the size of its full-size cars was heard by a Chrysler executive. Chrysler hurried to revamp their entire lineup in a frenzy. However, it turned out that the rumor was untrue. There was no reduction. At GM, the outcome, Plymouth essentially pulled out of one of the most significant market sectors in America by entering 1962 without a true full-size vehicle. Buyers perceived Plymouth as conceding defeat by ceasing to compete with the major players. The brand's slide only got worse from there. Plymouth would go on to live for almost 40 more years, but it never recovered its previous splendor. Not only did the 1961 model represent a single design error, but it also signaled the beginning of a sustained decline in customer trust. One of the most innovative and technologically sophisticated cars of its era was hidden beneath its peculiar facade. However, a negative first impression cannot be overcome by excellent engineering. The 1961 Plymouth serves as a reminder that design in the automotive industry is more than just aesthetics. It's a gut instinct and an emotional connection. In Plymouth's instance, the gap between what they constructed and its appearance was simply too great to close. This raises the question, did the 1961 Plymouth deserve its demise? Was it unfairly assessed solely on the basis of appearance? Or was its design too early and too far from what consumers wanted? Please share your opinions in the comments section below. In order to ensure that you never miss what comes next, please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and enable notifications if you have a strong interest in vintage automobiles, history, and the little-known tales of the auto industry.